In the mid-2000s, Rockstar were absolutely killing it. They had released Grand Theft Auto 3 and Vice City, the former of which established the sandbox genre, while its sequel expanded the formula and solidified Rockstar as a top-tier developer. Before the release of the monumental success that was Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Rockstar decided to take a break from the open-world sandbox genre they had established and moved on to a more intimate and violent project. That project was known as Manhunt, and it was released in 2003. It was a great departure from what the developers had been known for. Instead of driving around, working for crime bosses and destroying everything in your path, Manhunt would be a more slower and intimate affair. It was a stealth-based game with horror elements where instead of the player wanting to cause as much chaos as possible, they would have to sneak around and slowly dispatch enemies. What made this game a Rockstar title was how it pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in video games. The player would not just take out enemies silently and cleanly, they would absolutely brutalize them through the use of violent takedowns, which included decapitation and strangulation, amongst other things. I have always been interested in this game, but it was hard to get in Australia because it was initially banned. Luckily, everyone seems to have forgotten about this little video game, and I was finally able to sit down and give it a go. Here is my review of Manhunt. The core story of Manhunt involves James Earl Cash, a death row inmate who was arrested for being a part of an organised crime ring, either as an enforcer or a hitman. At least that is what the Wikipedia tells me. I couldn't figure this out while playing the game. Cash's execution is faked and he's forced to participate in a series of snuff films. The director of the snuff films, Lionel Starkweather, promises Cash his freedom if he follows his instructions. Those instructions being, kill some gang members in the most brutal way possible while he films it. After Cash does what he is told, Starkweather decides to go back on his deal, and instead of giving Cash his freedom, a group of private security experts called the Cerebus kidnap Cash, throw him in the back of a van, and take him to another place where he's told to kill more gang members. This repeats for a while until Cash is taken to an abandoned zoo where the gang in that area had kidnapped some of his family members, and Cash has to save them. Once he saves his family, or in my case, saves some of his family, he finds out that Starkweather had killed them anyway. At least Cash will save money during Christmas and birthdays, you know? Gotta look at the positives here. Cash swears to take revenge against Starkweather, who sets up Cash to die in the film's final scene. Of course, Cash doesn't die, and kills everyone who was sent to kill him. After some more killing, you see there's a bit of a pattern here, Cash runs into a journalist who is looking into Starkweather, and they escape with each other. She plans to expose Starkweather, but he makes this a little difficult when he bribes the police chief to hunt the pair down and kill them. Cue Cash killing loads of police officers while the journalist doesn't bat an eye.
Fuck the police coming straight from the underground.
The pair get to the journalist's apartment where Cash decides being a lone wolf is more his style. So he leaves the journalist and goes after Starkweather. Unfortunately, Cash is good at planning plans, but not the best at executing them. A SWAT team corners Cash at a train station. How he did not see any of these guys is a mystery to me. And instead of killing him right there, which would have been the smart thing to do, they take him to Starkweather's mansion. I don't understand the logic of this move, but who am I to question law enforcement? They don't survive for long as a fat man wearing the face of a pig kills them all. Yes, the face of a pig. Cash kills more of Starkweather's guards, and as he reaches the upper levels of the mansion, old Pigsy comes out wielding a chainsaw, and Manhunt turns into a horror game for about 20 minutes. Pigsy falls for a Looney Tunes trap, and Cash cuts off his hands. Or hooves, pig paws, whatever the fuck you want to call them. Cash kills more guards and finally runs into Starkweather, who runs around his office for a bit until Cash disembowels him and thrusts the chainsaw into his face. The journalist exposes the snuff film industry Starkweather had, and the police chief is arrested. Cash disappears into the night like a homicidal Batman, and the credits roll. The framework of Manhunt's plot is interesting, but the game doesn't do enough to explore itself, and as a result, the player's interest is quite minimal. The setup works well given the tone of the game. Cash is someone who did horrible things in his life, and instead of receiving the punishment he was sentenced to, he is forced to partake in a different kind of punishment. We are not supposed to like Cash. He is a terrible person, but that doesn't mean we can't connect with him or root for him to succeed. Many games and films feature terrible protagonists who the audience cares for. But how to do this is by giving the unlikable character a personality and clear motivations that we as the audience can relate to. Cash receives none of these things. He is a silent protagonist, for the most part. Only when he meets the journalist does he actually say something. He just comes across as a jackass. He never reacts to any of the situations he is in. He never questions his brutal actions throughout the story. He does nothing. Even when he watches his family get butchered, he doesn't say anything. As a player who is doing these terrible things, I need the motivation to do so. Give me a reason to justify the violence, otherwise it just comes across as violent for violence sake.
People say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's
Here we go
thoughts.
again.
Besides the lack of development for Cash, the other aspects of the plot are barely developed. For the first half of the game, nothing plot-wise really happens. The player is told by Starkweather to kill some people, and after that is done, Cash is taken by Starkweather's goons to another location, rinse and repeat until Cash runs into the journalist. Once Cash runs into her, we get the teeniest bit of plot development. She is going to expose Starkweather. Cash is like, cool, tells her to piss off while he goes and kills Starkweather. Nothing else happens until he actually kills him. We get a little news report at the end about the consequences of the journalist exposing the snuff film ring, and that is it. This game is 20 missions, not including the 4 bonus missions at the end. In that entire time, barely anything of note happens. I'm not asking for much here. Just give me something to actually get invested in. If Rockstar invested as much time into the characters' motivations and the plot as they did with the brutal takedowns, Manhunt could have had an amazing story. Instead, we got a game that has a clear focus, but failed to give the player any incentive to actually care about it. Manhunt is a stealth game, which means that the game wants the player to be sneaky, take out enemies without alerting others, and avoid combat as much as possible. The level design is very linear, but this doesn't take away from the gameplay or the atmosphere. In fact, most successful stealth games are linear in some sense, even if the levels are a little more open in how the design is approached. At all times, you know what you need to do and where you need to go. This allows the developer to focus more on how the player will approach each level. They know they will come from one way, so they can add obstacles that the player will have to work around. I don't have a problem with this kind of design, and I think it works for Manhunt. I never felt lost or confused, and it kept the game moving at a solid pace. The first major problem with Manhunt is that it isn't very good at actually executing the stealth aspect of the game. The player is limited to how they can approach an encounter. Cash can't crouch, so he's always just standing there, making himself as visible as possible. I didn't think it was possible to develop a stealth game without the ability to crouch. It is like the first thing you try to do when you play one. Not having the ability to crouch is jarring and also limits how the player can approach an encounter. So what can Cash do? Well, he can stand and walk slowly. When he does get close to an enemy, a reticule pops up that tells the player they can perform a brutal takedown. This part of the game was its main selling point, and I will discuss it further in the video. For now, we will move on. Another problem is with the game's controls. They are rough. Manhunt borrows a familiar control scheme from the PlayStation 2 era of Grand Theft Auto games. Those controls were clunky in those games, but it was fine because they were an open world title, and you didn't need precise controls because the player had lots of room to move. Manhunt is a stealth game, and the majority of levels tend to consist of tight corridors or small areas. Stealth games need tight and flexible controls so the player can maneuver through the environment easily, and if they are seen by the enemy, they can change control styles and escape or engage. If the controls aren't tight, it can lead to situations where the player can be noticed by guards or fail a mission because the controls limit the player's maneuverability. I can recall numerous times during my playthrough of Manhunt where I was noticed by enemies because I was struggling to get behind a pillar or walk through a door. It is times like these where it feels like the controls are working against the stealth. I honestly believe they needed to ditch the GTA control scheme and develop something new specific for Manhunt. That could have solved a lot of my problems. Oh, and put in a bloody crouch button. Cash also walks extremely slow, and without the ability to crouch, this means that you are very noticeable. I can't recall how many times I was caught because Cash's dumbass didn't know he could bend his knees and make himself harder to see. If you are lucky enough to get close enough and take an enemy out, they usually turn around and notice you. In fact, enemies tend to always turn around just as you're about to kill them. Don't even think about approaching an enemy that is standing still because the lack of motion must increase their hearing. After many, and I mean many times being caught by enemies because of their supersonic hearing, I found the best approach is to sneak up on them as they are walking. Nearly every time I did this, I was actually able to kill them. It seems like they struggle to do two things at once, in this case, walking and hearing. Some aspects of the stealth that Manhunt gets right is the use of sound. Nearly everything Cash does makes a sound. If he runs, knocks over a trash can, punches a car or knocks on a wall, an enemy can hear it. This adds a level of awareness on behalf of the player. You can't run everywhere because you may alert an enemy, so you can only use it when it's appropriate. You have to be aware of trash and debris in the ground in case you knock it over, but you can also use sound to separate groups of enemies or bring one towards you. This can be a great way of taking out gang members without alerting others. The use of sound in Manhunt is the most developed aspect of the stealth, which is great. I just wish every other aspect of the stealth had enough polish. If you are spotted, you only have two courses of action: run or fight. Running is the best option if you want to avoid combat and don't want to lose too much health. At first, I would try to run away tactically, like the US during the Vietnam War. But I began to notice the levels and the controls weren't really designed for losing a group of enemies. Levels are very small and offer a few areas to hide. Sometimes I would have to run back near the start of the level just so I could lose them. After a while though, I began to notice something. The enemy AI is very stupid if you know how to abuse it. If an enemy or group of enemies spot you, you just run around in circles and they will eventually lose you. Once they do this, hide in the shadows or behind some cover. Even if they were right behind you, they will not know where you are. Eventually, the enemies will give up searching for you and go back to their day-to-day routine of wandering around empty streets and yelling random nonsense. It isn't the smoothest or most elegant system of evasion, but it works. The only problem I find with it is how it completely altered my approach to levels. At first, I would try to play Manhunt as it was intended. Sneak around, avoid being spotted, use distractions to lure enemies and take them out one by one. For me, being spotted was the worst outcome. But once I figured out how dumb the AI was, instead of being a silent assassin, I would play recklessly. I would kill an enemy in front of his friends and just run around in circles till they gave up looking for me. Rinse and repeat until everyone is dead. This isn't fun, and it's my fault for playing the game that way. But when a game gives you a far superior and faster method of clearing its levels, I will take that route. If the AI was more thorough when they search and I couldn't just run around them like a Scooby-Doo cartoon, the game would have been more tense and rewarding. But that isn't the case, and that is a shame. If the player does get spotted and doesn't want to run around, they can always try their hand at combat. The problem is, combat is also clunky. What a surprise. This is because it takes combat from the Grand Theft Auto series without many alterations. The combat in GTA was never those games' strongest asset. Shooting was passable and functioned as intended, which is the same in Manhunt, but the melee combat was always terrible. In Manhunt, the developers attempted to improve this considering most of the weapons in the game are melee weapons. But the combat is pretty awful. Swings take too long to execute even if you are using the light attack, and the only way to block is to walk backwards like in Street Fighter. Enemy attacks tend to stun lock the player, and taking on more than one enemy at a time will usually end in death. So each encounter boils down to hitting the enemy until the combo ends, walking back and blocking as they hit you so you don't take as much damage, and repeating this process until your enemy is dead. Enemies hit so hard you want to try to avoid combat altogether, but with the undercooked stealth you will find yourself in combat scenarios more often than you like, and this can lead to frustration and many game over screens. The biggest problem with the combat comes in the later half of the game, and what turned me from enjoying the game despite its flaws to wishing it would stop. Instead of Manhunt getting creative with the stealth, introducing unique enemies, or getting creative with the situations the player must go up against, the game becomes a corridor shooter, and not a very good one. As I mentioned before, Manhunt uses the combat from GTA, and for those who have played those titles, the shooting wasn't very good. It worked, but it was nothing to write home about. But I'm going to write home about the shooting in Manhunt. It is by far the worst aspect of the game. Not because it doesn't work. You can lock onto an enemy, you shoot, and the enemy will die. But sometimes this actually doesn't happen. I noticed a frequent inconsistency with how much damage an enemy would take when you shoot them. Sometimes I would shoot someone and they would take a lot of damage. Sometimes I would take a small amount, and sometimes they wouldn't take any at all. At first, I thought the damage changed depending on the distance of the shot, or in the case of an enemy taking cover, maybe the cover they were behind blocked the shot. But numerous times during my playthrough of Manhunt, it felt like none of these things actually played a part in my damage output, and it was completely random. I would shoot one enemy and they would die instantly, while another at the same distance would take 2 or 3 shots. Enemies could be out in the open, but would take no damage when I shot them. This inconsistency made every gunfight a game of chance, and unless I pulled off a headshot, I could not rely on my guns to do constant or any damage. The fun part about this was that enemies didn't seem to have that problem. They would lock onto you with pinpoint accuracy. Whether they were close up or far away, they would absolutely destroy me. When they had guns in their hands, they were Rick Grimes from The Walking Dead, pulling off headshots from any distance without breaking a sweat. This doesn't sound too bad if the game kept gunfights to a minimum, or when they did happen, there weren't a lot of enemies and the levels accommodated for the shift in gameplay. That sounds fair, right? Well, as you can probably guess by how I set up the previous sentence, this is not the case. Manhunt will throw waves and waves of enemies at you at any one time. There are moments in this game where at least 8 enemies will be on the screen, all firing at once, and I have to embody Neo from the Matrix if I want any chance of surviving. Sure, the more open levels have cover, but it is a very primitive system. There is no blind firing ability to move from one cover to another. All you can do is occasionally pop your head up, try fire a few rounds. But as soon as you do, your position will be rained on by hails of gunfire. You barely have a chance to shoot anybody before you are dead. What makes this worse is the camera's habit of randomly locking onto enemies. You will be shooting one guy when the camera decides to snap to another. This doesn't just happen when an enemy gets closer to you, it happens when an enemy has the audacity to breathe. The player already has so many issues with gunfights. Sticky cover, inconsistent damage, and now they have to deal with a camera that has a mind of its own, and don't even bother trying to free aim. The camera will decide to snap onto enemies even if you don't want to. This is further exacerbated in the levels where most gunfights take place. In tight corridors or small rooms. Any gunfight that takes place in these levels is a battle of attrition. With the enemy's high damage output, the number of enemies, your lack of cover, and the lock-on camera trying everything it can to screw you over, you will die over and over again. Until these levels came around, I didn't die many times playing Manhunt. These shooting levels are not difficult, they are not rewarding, they are frustrating, and replaying the same levels over and over again turns these gunfights from somewhat enjoyable to tedious and borderline unforgivable. I can't believe a game with such a high focus on stealth and brutality forgot about what makes it interesting and unique, and instead just became a very poor third-person shooter. The enemies consist of members from a variety of gangs, each with their own distinct looks, beliefs, prejudices, and personalities. The enemy designs is one of my favourite part of Manhunt. I honestly love how some of the gangs look. Though many boil down to dude in a mask, Rockstar at least tried to set them apart, which is admirable. The dated PlayStation 2 graphics don't make them sinister enemies to look at, but the dialogue paints a picture of who they are and what they represent, which becomes a major reason why the player will fear them. They yell out racist or sexist things at Cash while searching for him. If they spot him, they will say something along the lines of, "I want to skull fuck you." They really are terrible fucking people, and that is what makes them so interesting. The design of Casa City also plays a major role in my enjoyment of Manhunt. The city is run down, pillaged, and desolate. Damaged and abandoned cars sit empty on the streets. Rubbish and drug paraphernalia blow across the pavement. There are many construction sites abandoned long ago, which shows that even the city has given up on improving itself. The only times you see someone who isn't trying to kill you is when you find a corpse with its head blown off in a dirty bathroom cubicle, or when you escort this hobo guy around. Though it doesn't reach the same level of character as Liberty City or Vice City, Casa City had a distinct personality that makes it feel oppressive and dangerous, which makes it a perfect addition to the tone of Manhunt. It is a disgusting place where people come to die, and that makes your journey to escape this wretched hive of scum and villainy all the more engaging. But this very minimalist and decayed look does mean that every level kinda looks basically the same. You will run through numerous alleyways, streets, or construction sites that look exactly the same as the ones you just ran through. If the city was given a bit more variety instead of industrial areas or the colour grey, it could have reached the level of personality as found in the GTA games. Still, I enjoyed it for what it's worth and wish I could have seen more of it. It would be hard to talk about Manhunt without discussing the violence. To put it simply, this game made me squirm, and I don't usually do that. That is an impressive feat considering all of the character models look like potatoes. Former Rockstar employee Jeff Williams said that some of the staff were actually uncomfortable with the level of violence in Manhunt. Quote, "It just made us feel icky. It was all about the violence, and it was realistic violence. We all knew there was no way we could explain that away in game. There was no way to rationalize it. We were crossing a line." Jeff was right. The game was banned in several countries, including Australia where I live, and the usual controversy surrounding any Rockstar game came into full force. Funnily enough, the hot coffee issue in San Andreas, which was a hidden sex minigame deep in the game's code, drew more heat from politicians than a game about murdering people with plastic bags. They have their priorities straight, I guess. The violence is mainly seen in the range of weapons the developer use in the game and how these weapons are used by the player. The player and the enemies will have access to plastic bags, glass shards, machetes, nail guns, sawn-off shotguns, just to name a few. When these weapons hit their target, the blow feels deliberate and punishing. Enemies stagger back or put up their arms in defense. Once they are on low health, they fall to the ground in the fetal position and start begging for their lives. All the player can do is forget about any sort of empathy and just finish the job. Where the brutality of Manhunt really shows itself is in the game's stealth takedowns. This part of the game is where the grotesque, unforgiving world of Manhunt comes full circle. As I explained earlier, when you sneak up on an enemy while locked on, a grey hovering reticule will pop up. If you press the action button again, they will perform a stealth takedown. The beautiful thing about Manhunt is, if you continue to hold the action button, the colour of the reticule will change to yellow and then red. Each colour represents the brutality of the stealth takedown you are about to perform. Grey being a little bit brutal, while red being the most violent. Each level of stealth takedown is pretty violent, but the game subtly encourages the player to be as violent as possible. It knows you want to see how violent it can get. So whenever the player gets a new weapon, they immediately want to see how violent Cash can be with it. 2 red level takedowns that I vividly remember is when the player has the glass shard or the machete equipped. The red level stealth takedown with the glass shard has Cash turn the enemy around and stab them numerous times in the face. It makes this squishy noise that just makes me feel uncomfortable. With the machete, Cash will constantly hit the enemy in the stomach and finish them off by decapitating them. But not just one clean slice, it takes a couple of goes. The sound the game makes when the machete is cutting through the enemy's neck sounds so realistic. The funny thing about that takedown is that you can use the decapitated head as a distraction item, so, you win some. The narrative does give Cash an excuse to be as violent as he is. Also, he wasn't a nice guy to begin with, so the fact that Cash murders people in what some might say is a wee bit over the top is fitting for his character. But it is not enough of an excuse to make the violence move past its shock value. But I feel like Rockstar thought about the takedown system first, and since they knew they would receive backlash for it, they tried to develop a narrative reason for it to exist. Too bad the narrative reason is as basic as the game's a snuff film. We see this with films like Saw or Hostel. They are violent for violence sake. They want to create a controversy because it will sell tickets. I am not saying that Rockstar upped the violence for this sole reason, but I do believe they knew that the backlash would hype up the game, which is why the takedowns are the most fleshed out aspect of Manhunt. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy violent films and games, but when that's the whole point, and there is nothing else to it, I lose interest pretty quickly. Manhunt was a very mixed bag for me. I love the world and the core idea of both the plot and the gameplay, but the underdeveloped story and characters, the awkward controls, the restrictive stealth mechanics, and the action-focused second half all took away from my enjoyment. If this game just had a bit more work done on nearly every aspect of it and had a greater focus, it could have been amazing, but that isn't what we got. The funny part about this though is that even though I come across as really not liking Manhunt, I do not regret my time playing it. Sure, for a lot of it, I wasn't enjoying my time, but I honestly think that the core ideas alone make it enough to make this title worth checking out. It's one of those games that isn't great, isn't terrible, but it sits somewhere in the middle. I'm glad I played it, and I would recommend it to anyone else who enjoys games that are a little bit rough on the edges, or you just want to fucking murder people. Thank you everybody for sitting through my rant about Manhunt. Leave a like if you liked it, dislike it if you disliked it, and leave a comment. Let me know what you think of the game if you've played it, or if this review made you want to kind of check it out. I'll see you guys next time when I make another video. Don't know when that's going to happen, but stop bothering me about it!